Good morning. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President here at CSIS with responsibilities for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic. And I am absolutely delighted that we could have this very timely conversation about the ongoing crisis in Europe, the migration challenge. We are so pleased and delighted to welcome Thomas Zwiefelhofer, the Deputy Prime Minister of Liechtenstein, who can give us a bird's eye view, if you will. Although not a member of the European Union, Liechtenstein is part of the Schengen Agreement, the Dublin Convention. The Deputy Prime Minister has been in some of these European Interior Minister meetings, which have been quite active, vocal, if you will, and talking about the crisis. And we look forward to the Deputy Prime Minister's overview of the situation from the European perspective. After the Deputy Prime Minister concludes his remarks, I will welcome both the Deputy Prime Minister and our two other guests, Catherine Wiesner, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, to offer her reflections, as well as Shelly Pitterman, the Regional Representative for the United States and Canada from the United Nations Commission on Refugees. So we have wonderful guests who can help us understand the dimensions of the challenge, future policies, future activities that need to occur from the European perspective, the international organization perspective, and the American perspective. So let me formally welcome Deputy Prime Minister Dr. Thomas Zwiefelhofer, who is Deputy Prime Minister since March of 2013. To say that the Deputy Prime Minister has many jobs may be an understatement. He is both Minister of Home Affairs, Justice, and Economic Affairs. That's like combining here, I guess, our Justice Department, our Finance Ministry, our Commerce Department, Department of Homeland Security. He does it all in one portfolio. He is a member of the Patriotic Union Party, one of the two political parties in Liechtenstein that comprise the governing coalition. He has served in governance at the municipal level, as well as throughout his party. He has served as honorary consul in Poland, and we are absolutely thrilled that he could be able to join us. So with your applause, please join me in welcoming Deputy Prime Minister Zwiefelhofer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, Heather. It's a great pleasure to be here at CSIS and have the opportunity to address the important topic of the European refugees and migration crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, for many months, a humanitarian disaster of enormous proportions has been taking place. Millions of people are fleeing from Middle Eastern and Arab countries to Europe, many from war zones like Syria, Somalia, Afghanistan, or Iraq, others from economically weak countries with almost no perspective for the future. In total, 60 million people worldwide are fleeing their homes. Each day, this number is rising by tens of thousands, abandoning their places of origin for reasons I just mentioned. The numbers, which stand for just as many human destinies, have reached a depressing new record. Wars, conflicts, and crises have caused people to become internally displaced within their own countries or force them to flee across national borders. The deadly dimension of the catastrophic situation can be seen especially in the Mediterranean Sea. The flow of refugees across the Mediterranean Sea has increased dramatically in recent years. Smuggling rings send desperate people on life-threatening journeys on overflowing boats that are not always seaworthy, and not seldom these journeys end in death. According to UNHCR, 137,000 people fled across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe in the first half of 2015. Approximately 3,000 of them died during the attempt. Italy and Greece are literally being overrun by these inflows of refugees. Apart from the Mediterranean, the refugee and migration flows have meanwhile also increased dramatically on the so-called Balkan route. Over the past days and weeks, the situation has gotten almost completely out of control. And some European countries have temporarily reintroduced border controls, while others are sealing off their borders or are turning into pure transit countries. 30 years after the signing of the Schengen Agreement to create an area where freedom, security, and a common regulatory framework prevail, and thus Europe without borders, the continent is now facing one of its greatest challenges of the last decades. These flows of refugees should not be the problem solely of those countries that are directly affected. Solidarity is essential, and so the European Commission presented a European agenda on migration last May. This agenda suggests an action plan against smuggling networks, as well as a mechanism for the relocation and resettlement of asylum seekers and refugees. The debate about the distribution of refugees has turned into a veritable test of the stability of the European Union. There is, unfortunately, little evidence of European unity. In the follow-up to the European agenda of migration and after weeks of debate, the 28 EU Home Affairs ministers adopted a first program in July to relocate 40,000 persons from Italy and Greece to other member states, as well as a program to resettle 20,000 refugees from third countries. At the end of September, another decision was made to relocate an additional 120,000 persons from Italy and Greece. While the first relocation program was adopted by consensus as usual, the decision on the second relocation program, the one with the 120,000 persons, was not. It was made against the objections of 4 EU countries. That decision was of historical impact. For the first time, the EU has taken a decision of the highest importance in the area of migration, not by consensus, but rather by using qualified majority voting. The outvoted member states now have to take back this decision. How many refugees the individual EU member state should accept has been defined according to a proposed binding distribution key. For the future, the introduction of a permanent crisis mechanism is also planned for the relocation of refugees by amending the relevant Dublin legislation. The intention is for this mechanism to be activated for member states when they experience a crisis situation, thus calling the Dublin regulation into question through an extraordinary pressure. And when those member states are exposed to a large and disproportionate influx of third country nationals or stateless persons, putting a considerable strain on their asylum systems. The goal is to avoid future disputes and time-consuming negotiations about the number of refugees to be accepted by each country. The distribution of the refugees to be relocated to the other countries in the Dublin system should, according to the proposal, be determined in accordance with the following criteria. The size of the population of the host member state is weighted with 40%, the wealth of the host member state as measured by total GDP, another 40%, the unemployment rate with 10%, and the average number of asylum applications over the 5 preceding years per million inhabitants. That's another 10%. Relocation will make use of so-called hotspots, where refugees to be distributed will be identified and registered in advance. The European Asylum Support Office, EASO, the EU Borders Agency, Frontex, the European Police Office, Europol, and the EU's Juridical Cooperation Unit, Eurojust, work together on site with the authorities of the member states concerned in order to help them meet their obligations under EU law to implement and run such hotspots. Liechtenstein is member of most of these EU agencies and thus involved into these procedures. Nevertheless, all of this is really just treating the symptoms. The redistribution of refugees is only the short-term solution for a small part of a much larger problem. Europe has to strive for a common, long-term and durable asylum policy. As the events of the past weeks and days have shown, Europe is still far from that point. Europe must also strengthen its assistance on site and in the crisis countries and refugee camps and act jointly against the smuggling networks. The actual causes of the refugee disaster must be solved outside Europe. As long as attempts to stabilize the situation in the crisis countries are unsuccessful, the refugee crisis will get worse. I was particularly touched by the response of a Syrian child to a question of a journalist about what should be done now. The answer of the child was, just stop the war. I would now like to focus on the Principality of Liechtenstein, my country. Liechtenstein is not a member of the European Union, Heather has mentioned that, because it is presently not considered the appropriate form of integration for a very small state with an area of 62 square miles and a population of only 37,000. However, Liechtenstein is linked into the European Union through a series of multilateral and bilateral agreements, on which the European Economic Area, the EEA, certainly is the most important and far-reaching. When Liechtenstein became an associated member of the Schengen area and joined the Dublin system at the end of 2011, the country made another large step towards strengthening its integration with the European Union, and we are proud of that. My country has a long humanitarian tradition and contributes to the extent possible. In 2014, Liechtenstein spent $25 million on projects in emergency and reconstruction assistance, international refugee and migration assistance, and development cooperation. This year, the expenditures will be increased significantly. Liechtenstein's amount this year will to approximately 2.7% of government spending. As a sign of pan-European solidarity for better burden sharing, Liechtenstein is one of the 28 countries in the world participating in the UNHCR resettlement program. As part of this program, Liechtenstein accepted 6 Syrian refugee families since last year, a total of 23 persons. Sounds like a small figure, but if you remind the size of our country, in proportion, it's a big figure. These numbers are low, maybe, but they are considerable for a small state. We are very convinced about that. The crucial question is not necessarily how a small sovereign country like Liechtenstein solves migration problems in concrete terms, but rather whether a small country is able to make these decisions independently in the first place. To what extent can we still be considered sovereign and thus autonomous when facing these challenges? To answer this question, I would like to include some thoughts about Liechtenstein as part of the international community and about sovereignty of a small state. The right of a country to self-determination is a crucial feature for the sovereignty of every state. Self-determination ultimately is derived from sovereignty. Conversely, the extent of self-determination is an indicator of the actual sovereignty of a state. For a small country like Liechtenstein, it is vital that we always emphasize and affirm our sovereignty, since it is directly linked to the right of self-determination and the freedom of action. But how can sovereignty be affirmed and strengthened, especially for a small country like Liechtenstein? Only through a strong and smart foreign policy, but also through a clear commitment to European integration can we ultimately strengthen ourselves. Liechtenstein was able to celebrate 200 years of sovereignty in 2006. But that sovereignty had to be fought for and defended again and again throughout history. For a long time, the independence of our country was not at all taken for granted, and it was often called even into question. Only once we joined various organizations and international bodies, such as the Council of Europe, the OSCE, the United Nations, the European Economic Area, the Schengen, did Liechtenstein become a fully recognized member of the international community. Liechtenstein wants to be and has to be part of the international community, and it has to work closely together with its neighboring countries, not at the price of losing its independence, but on the contrary, in order to secure its sovereignty. As a Minister of Home Affairs of a doubly landlocked country within the Schengen area, I also deal with the Schengen external borders, even though we do not have any external borders ourselves. We are part of Europe and make our contribution. Sovereignty also means acting as a partner. The Schengen and Dublin systems were designed as systems that continuously evolve in order to deal with new challenges in the field of security and asylum. Liechtenstein depends on a smoothly functioning Schengen and Dublin system. As an associated Schengen-Dublin state, Liechtenstein has the opportunity and also the obligation to contribute to the smooth functioning of this system and make our views known in the relevant bodies and also in the Council of Ministers. As an associated state, Liechtenstein has to implement further developments of the Schengen Dublin acquis as well, of course, like every member state. The redistribution of approximately 160,000 refugees is an emergency measure that was adopted outside the legal framework of Schengen. As an associated Schengen state, Liechtenstein is thus not required to participate, but it can do so as a sign of pan-European solidarity on a voluntary basis. All 4 associated states, which means also Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, were in fact invited to participate by the European Commission and the Luxembourg presidency of the Council. In the spirit of our humanitarian tradition and as a sign of pan-European solidarity, but also in the interest of a smoothly functioning Dublin system on which we are dependent, Liechtenstein has declared its willingness to participate voluntarily in the resettlement program as well in the 2 new relocation programs. Liechtenstein is currently not a destination country for refugees. This is probably due to the geographic location of our country, but also perhaps to its lower level of familiarity. Nevertheless, the situation can change from one day to the next. We are a neighbor of Austria. You remember Austria, which a huge problem has with the huge numbers of refugees. We are prepared, and we have established a task force for asylum questions for this purpose, so we are ready. But of course, as you can imagine, as a small country, Liechtenstein will be very soon in a difficult position to respond on a bigger number of refugees coming into our country. So right now, we are very lucky that we are not touched directly, but that can change very quickly. The priorities of the EU refugee policy go far beyond the redistribution of refugees, of course. They include the following measures: to help the frontline member states, to enhance cooperation with the Western Balkan countries, with Turkey and the countries bordering Syria, to provide budgetary assistance to the High Commissioner for Refugees and the World Food Programme, to accelerate the implementation of agreed policies on return and readmission, to discuss diplomatic efforts to solve the Syrian crisis, whatever that means, to establish a permanent distribution mechanism among the Dublin member states, and to organize return and readmission more effectively. That's very important, the last point, for the understanding of the people. People say, we are ready to allow asylum to people, but we only want to give asylum to people who really need it. There is one matter that is the most pressing of all. The World Food Programme needs money to provide food to 11 million displaced people in Syria and the region. As a concrete measure, the heads of state and governments in the European Union decided at their special meeting on September 23rd to support the UN World Food Programme and other organizations with a contribution of at least 1 billion euros. This is certainly a ray of hope. The coming weeks and months will show if and how Europe will be able to handle the refugee crisis and if the current European structures function well enough. Liechtenstein will involve itself actively in the discussions and will try to contribute to the solution-finding process. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Well, let me welcome Catherine and Shelley to the podium here, and then we will start our panel. Well, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, thank you for those comments and the clarity of those comments and explaining to us the process, both from a pan-European perspective, but also from a country, a very small-sized country that sees its sovereignty strengthened by your integration. I thought your point was excellent. I have several questions for you, but I think what we might do, with your permission, I think let's welcome Shelley and Catherine into the discussion with some opening remarks, and then I'd like to bring you all into the conversation and perhaps interact with the Deputy Prime Minister's comments. So let me begin by, again, welcoming Shelly Pitterman, the Regional Representative and Head of the UNHCR's office here in Washington, a position that he has held since arriving here from becoming he led the division of the UNHCR's Human Resources from 2008 before he arrived here. Shelly also served as Director of Operations for the UN Relief and Works Agency in Jordan from 2005 to 2008, and you certainly have great understanding of what is going on in Jordan today, and we would welcome your perspective. Shelly has has been part of the UNHCR family since 1984 and has served with distinction in regions such as Sudan, Burundi, Guinea, so a vast experience, and we know how busy you are, and so we're extremely grateful that you are with us. And then after Shelly has provided his opening remarks, we'll return to Catherine Wiesner, again, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, a position you've held since February of 2012. Prior to that, Catherine served as Principal Deputy, this is a long Pentagon title, forgive me, Principal Deputy to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for African Affairs. Whew, got that one out. But Catherine, prior to her government service, worked for UNICEF in Sudan, Uganda, Darfur, has extraordinary field experience working in Sierra Leone and a variety of positions in the Middle East, so your field expertise and experience will be so valuable to us. So let me, as moderator, get out of the way. And Shelly, can I turn to you for just some quick framing remarks, and then Catherine, and then we'll begin our discussion. Welcome.
Well, thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be alongside the Deputy Prime Minister, whose remarks were very positive and very good to hear. I just want to recall the first number that you mentioned, which was 60 million. 60 million people forcibly displaced. It's the highest number since World War II. Clearly, there's a global story happening with respect to forced displacement, where more than 42,000 people are moving every day. And whereas in the past we had protracted situations, we knew of Somalia and Afghanistan and Colombia, and we had emergencies for several months or for a year, and we went out with appeals. Now, over recent years, we've been struck by the new phenomenon of protracted emergencies. And the one of note that's really driving the refugee agenda globally these days is the Syria-Iraq mega crisis, which has become quite challenging, not only in terms of its humanitarian dimension, of course, but also its security dimension and the financial aspect, which is rendering the humanitarian system as we know it very seriously at risk of underfunding. And you mentioned that with respect to the last decision of the European heads of state to support WFP and UNHCR and other organizations. This has been the underfunding of our humanitarian work in the neighboring countries of Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq has been, for the High Commissioner, the trigger for the recent flow of refugees through the Eastern Mediterranean. But it's coupled with two more structural pushes. One is a despair among Syrians that the war is just continuing, that there's no end in sight, and families are taking proper decisions about what they need to do in order to take care of their families, as you or I would under such circumstances. They're, remember, coming out of a middle-class background, they had businesses, they were doctors, they were teachers, they were businessmen, and they're thinking about their futures. The second important trigger is impoverishment. Because of the underfunding, because of the structural challenges in Lebanon and in Jordan, the refugees, Syrians, are impoverished increasingly and need to find a better way for themselves. But fundamentally, this is a push. There's a push because of the war in Syria. There's a push because of lack of support. And these are refugees now, overwhelmingly from Syria, Afghanistan, Eritrea. The main refugee-producing countries globally are finding their way now across Turkey to Greece and up through the Balkan route to Central and Northern Europe and Western Europe. I think it's important to frame this fundamentally as a refugee situation. We can call it a crisis, we can call it an emergency, but bear in mind that the 500,000 people who've recently, in the last year, crossed through Italy and Greece to Europe, that represents 1% of Europe's population. And think about Lebanon, where 25% of the national population, in a country the size of Maryland, are now Syrian refugees, and they're not in camps. There's a misperception in general that refugees are all in camps. It's in Jordan, maybe 15–20% are in camps. In Turkey, the same, although the percentage is reduced as the numbers of refugees grows. In Lebanon, there are no camps. We consider that the challenges in Europe are manageable. There is a legal framework, it's a resource-rich territory, there's unity in principle in Europe, and had there been more preparation, more awareness, more political will, more leadership, we think, as UNHCR, that this problem could have been better addressed. And we think that there's still an opportunity for better management of this refugee situation, refugee crisis, through a collaborative approach. This cannot be solved by any one country, Germany or Sweden. It needs the engagement of all European states. And it's not about stemming the tide. I think the Deputy Prime Minister was very clear that there needs to be a multidimensional approach, not only to receive, register, and support these victims of violence, they are refugees, but also to address the needs of the countries immediately bordering Syria in a more holistic and sustained way over several years to come, if not decades, through development and reinforcement of infrastructure. I'd like to give a quote from the High Commissioner, and then I'll let Catherine continue, although I have more to say, but maybe in the Q&A we can deal with that. The High Commissioner said, and these are quotes now going back to 2014 and 13, it's an easy solution to close doors, but you should forget about it. When a door is closed, people will open up a window. And if the window is closed, people will dig a tunnel. If there's a basic need of survival, a basic need of protection, people will move. Whatever obstacles are put in their way, those obstacles will only make their journeys more dramatic. And we've seen that since more than a year that the High Commissioner made those remarks, in the context of Syria, but not only in the context of Syria, we see that as more restrictions are imposed or razor wire fences are built, that refugees who need to move will turn to smugglers and traffickers, that they'll find other routes. If it's not going to be through Serbia, it'll be through Croatia, in order to find safety, security, in order to get asylum. So with those few remarks, I'll hand it over. Thank you very much.
Shelley, thank you. That was incredibly informative. And I think a lot of the conversation we're having is sort of that myth busting. What we're reading in the media sometimes is not the accuracy that we seek. So I thank you so much for those comments. Catherine, you are watching these events and engaged deeply in them from the State Department. We welcome your perspective.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I'm also honored to be here with my co-panelists who have already painted a very compelling picture of a dramatic situation. So I will try to build on that with just a few framing remarks about how the U.S. government and the State Department and the humanitarian part of the State Department, which I represent today, views this. And I should say I come from the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. So conveniently, both refugees and migration are in the title of the work that we do, which is very relevant, I think, to the discussion today. As has been well stated, it's an unprecedented crisis of displacement in the world today. I have gotten requests. We've all been following in the media the debates about whether this is a migration or a refugee crisis. There's online debates about it, and I, in fact, have received calls from our own operations center saying, which one is it? And my response was, it's both. And I think what is also important in that debate is that the distinction between refugees and migrants, while there are very clear legal definitions, is not the distinction, as the High Commissioner for Human Rights said in an event last week in New York at the UN General Assembly. It's not the distinction between deserving and undeserving people. So any response to this crisis must focus on saving lives, must focus on respecting, ensuring the human rights of all people, migrants, refugees, different categories of vulnerable people are respected, and that humane migration policies are in place. I think that, as it has been noted, this crisis that we're seeing play out so dramatically on our TV screens in Europe has really concentrated minds on looking at the root causes and specifically at the conflict in Syria, but it's really important, as both of the speakers have already noted, that while the majority of people arriving in Greece right now may be Syrians, there are many, many Afghans, Somalis, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, so people who are coming from active conflict zones and people who are not necessarily coming from active conflict zones. So it's a very complex mix of factors driving this movement. I mentioned I was in New York last week for the UN General Assembly, so I'll just go through sort of what our very basic US government objectives have been in responding to this. And I should say, overall, how we would characterize the US government's position is that there's a shared responsibility for this global crisis. We see the impacts on Europe, we can look at all the different root causes and fundamentally believe that all nations who are in positions of responsibility, who have capabilities, who have power, who have opportunity, have to come together to address all the complex dimensions of this crisis. So the first is closing the gap in the humanitarian funding appeals that Shelly already mentioned. The US is the largest donor to the Syria crisis and to humanitarian assistance worldwide, and we really see our role as partnering with Europe in getting others to step up more. We do need to look at the situation of refugees in their countries of first asylum. With so many protracted displacement situations going on, it's ever more important that refugees actually live in dignity in their countries of first asylum, that their kids are able to go to school, that they're able to work and provide for their families. These are certainly some of the reasons driving people to look for opportunity elsewhere. And those countries that are hosting large numbers of refugees, and I know that Antonio Guterres, Shelley's boss, has been a huge proponent of this, need to receive more assistance, and they need to receive more than just humanitarian assistance. They need fundamental development assistance for their societies to be able to support those social services like schools and health services that both refugees and their own citizens need and will benefit from. Also need to recognize that it's not just a Syrian problem. As I said, there are many countries of origin and transit, and maybe we can talk a little bit later about some of the initiatives between the EU and African leaders to address some of those aspects of the crisis. And then finally, just to talk about briefly, and we can talk more, the US government's cooperation with Europe specifically. So having said that this is about so much more than Europe, of course, we do have a relationship with Europe. And I think that's along sort of four lines. One is our humanitarian assistance, recognizing, as Shelley said, that a humanitarian crisis in Europe is sort of unique to most of the places where we're responding around the world. It's a developed region of the world, and the challenges should be manageable. That said, UNHCR, the International Organization for Migration, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the local Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, who are the traditional humanitarian partners that we support, are all playing very important roles. So we continue to support their work and encourage other governments to do so. We have important law enforcement cooperation with European countries to get at some of these smuggling networks, some of the financial flows. And also recognizing that Europe may be a developed region, but it's made up of a number of member states of differing capabilities. We do have a number of bilateral relationships with countries that are part of Europe to provide support with border security. We've done training, our Coast Guard has done training in Malta on search and rescue. We've provided again, border security assistance in Macedonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania. It's a whole-of-government effort. Our Department of Defense has also gotten bilateral requests to supply basic excess materials like cots and tents and blankets. We've been looking at some of those. And then finally, I think one of the most important areas where we can share best practices and ideas with Europe and with other countries that we'd like to get more involved is on the integration of new arrivals, new refugees who are part of relocation schemes or resettlement schemes or humanitarian visa schemes. There's a whole host of ways that we would recommend and support countries to welcome more migrants and refugees to their countries, and we have a strong tradition as being the largest resettlement country in the world. You've probably heard recent announcements of increasing the numbers from 70,000 last year to at least 85,000 this year and 100,000 next year. And we've gotten a lot of interest in our conversations with our European counterparts on how we can share our experiences in helping new arrivals, refugees resettled in the U.S., integrate here. So some of those are the law enforcement cooperation and the resettlement sharing of best practices are some of the topics of our specific cooperation discussions with European countries.
Catherine, thank you very, very much. Just 3 great presentations. Looking forward to jumping right in. I'd like to ask just a few questions to get the ball rolling, and then we welcome our audience into the discussion. I have to say that 60 million figure, the largest population displacement since the end of the Second World War. A question to all 3 of our panelists, and I'll give you all 3 of these, and then we'll go down the line and to respond to them. Are we in a new normal? Is this what we now have to anticipate for a long term as you said, the mega conflict, these protracted conflicts? Because, Shelley, I was struck by your comment that, if Europe had been prepared or better prepared for this, are we going to have to be prepared for not only conflict and economic reasons, climate change is also going to be another reason? Are we looking at something really, a geopolitical movement that we have to prepare for? And how do you prepare for this? And then my second question, focusing a little bit more on Germany. My reflections of the German decision to welcome the refugees and the migrants that were coming, both a humanitarian gesture, but clearly there lacked coordination. You had to travel to get to Germany. There had to be coordination with the transit countries. You did have rules and regulations that clearly were suspended. Particularly, Deputy Prime Minister, your thoughts on that, because the fact that extraordinary decision was made as qualified majority, sovereign, border security, who you allow in your country for however long a period of time, or ultimate resettlement, is ultimately the essence of sovereignty, and that just seemed to me, while a humanitarian gesture could potentially be quite destabilizing to the European project, as you noted. So I would welcome your thoughts on Germany and the impact of that decision, because clearly 160,000 was the first part. What happens when the next decision for 200,000 resettled or more if these flows continue to come? And then finally, you all touched upon the need for humanitarian assistance, development assistance, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I think a figure I saw that really the appeals that have gone out, only the needs have been met to 25%. Maybe that has increased more recently. Again, how do we get at the long-term development challenges? How do the international financial institutions, the World Bank, others, again, if we're looking at this as a long-term problem, how are we reorienting our entire development structure to address this? And then finally, maybe Catherine, for you, there has been concern about the U.S. process of screening. It has been so terribly slow as we've welcomed Syrians into the United States. If I could just ask you to focus a little on that. Tell us about that process, how it can be expedited, and what the politics are here a bit on that process. Easy questions for our panelists. They're going to have no problems answering that, and we will begin with the Deputy Prime Minister to illuminate us on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Heather, for these easy questions.
Yes.
we can solve the world, save the world here
Let's
on
do it.
today. We try at least. No, three very interesting points you made. First, you asked about, is it the new normal? All these migration flows all over the world, 60 million people. It's an incredible figure. I would just like to point out or to focus on a certain issue. I think it's very interesting to see. Since 15, 20 years, we have a huge trend to globalization, not economically, but also digital-wise. The world is a small planet. If Chancellor Merkel says something about refugee welcome in Germany, in about 10 minutes later, in every refugee camp, in any place in the world, it's on the mobile phone of any person, and all these people, most of them have already phones and smartphones. So what you say in Germany is in a minute in a refugee camp in Jordan. So everything is very small, very quick, very global. And I think this digital global world we have nowadays, where everyone knows everything all over the planet, leads to also to physical globalization. And of course, these migration flows have a lot to do, from my point of view, with this digital small planet we are nowadays. So information flows quickly in every corner of the world, and of course the reaction is also a physical reaction on digital information flow, which is much quicker, much faster. So I guess these two things are connected, and in this point of view, I would say it could be the new normal that that the physical world also reacts on the digital global world we have nowadays. So it has to be a reaction, of course. Then, second point you mentioned is this German welcome refugee culture. I just wanted to clarify. The refugee welcome culture was developed after the refugees were flowing in and the border was out of control. And it was not first that Germany said, we welcome every refugee, please come to us, but it was a reaction on the fact that these people were coming. So that's an important difference. I guess Germany, maybe there was also a communication issue a little bit. It reminded me a little bit on this famous border man in the Eastern German Republic, where he said, when he was asked by a journalist in 1989, when is the border open to Western Germany? And he said, oh, as far as I know, it's from now it's open. And remember that was one sentence in a press conference, and half an hour later, millions of people went to the border, and the police had to open the border. So one comment of a politician or a responsible person can change the situation. I guess the comments in Germany changed the situation within a day. And now the question is sovereignty. The decision you mentioned, the problems European states have regarding their own sovereignty in deciding how many refugees we accept and how many not. My point is clear, and that's the point of the Liechtenstein government. You cannot just profit from the economic benefits of a single market and all these other benefits of European Union, and in the same time, if it's getting difficult in another topic, say, well, but here we are sovereign, we don't want to be involved in this issue. But that's the point of our government and others. Switzerland has the same position as far as I know. But I respect that, of course, these governments of other countries are also elected governments. They have to pass votes. They have to stand their democratic voter base. And it's very important and very difficult to explain to the people why we should welcome these refugees, that these refugees can also be a chance for our countries. You know, the demographic change is a problem. We need certain skilled labor force. We need certain immigration also for the social security systems, but there are limits. And to explain where is the limit, how far can we go, how far is intelligence, and to stop at the point where it's intelligent, to find the right method to stop. That's very difficult. It's if you open the door for the water flows, and to close the door is much more difficult than to open it. So that's the point, and I think solidarity is the key for the solution, and European countries should stand together for a solidarity solution in order to settle this issue, and the approach must be step by step. First step must be we have to regain control over the borders, the external borders. It cannot be that the uncontrolled flow of people comes into Europe. I remind you on the security issues we didn't touch today so far, ISIS issue and so on. I remind you on certain problems we have with far-right parties. People have fears about strangers coming. So first step is, yes, there must be a legal way to Europe. We want immigration, it can help us, but it must be controlled. What we right now have is uncontrolled immigration, and that is the first step to the solution. We have to regain control at the border. That's the first step. And step number 4 maybe is then about how the Syrian conflict can be ended and so on. That's much more complicated. But first, let's stop this uncontrolled situation at the external borders of Europe, together with the international organizations which help us, and it's a huge task.
Thank you. Thank you. Shelly, please.
Yes. The 60 million refers to people who are forcibly displaced. Obviously, there are many, many more millions of people who are moving as immigrants, seeking employment, working, students, business people. This is about forced displacement, and the core challenge that we've got is to resolve conflict, is to help governments to, if they're out of control, to get them back in line. If they're weak in terms of authority, to help them exercise that authority with due respect for human rights. So we have situations in Central African Republic, in Yemen, and so on, that are generating a constant outflow and a constant internal displacement that's challenging the international humanitarian system, and it will remain the new normal until there are political resolutions to these problems. And here we need to see the United States and other leaders, and PRM is at the forefront of humanitarian diplomacy, much to its credit, to bring the humanitarian dimension, but also to press for political solutions to the extent that that's possible. And clearly the security dimension is very key, but what's driving this as well is impoverishment, development challenges, climate change, technology, and the like. So we see that as part of the SDG, as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the imperative to leave no one behind, for UNHCR it's very important that refugees, who are very often outside the development planning frameworks of countries, they need to be brought in. And that they're not going to do on their own because then they'll pay loans and they'll pay interest on supporting refugees, which is an additional responsibility. So we see here the opportunity for longer-term development planning alongside humanitarian response as the way forward. Not that we do humanitarian, we see there's a development challenge, and then we call in the development actors. There needs to be an integrated, long-term, multi-year response that helps countries take care of asylum seekers in ways that they used to. We're facing a challenge now, I think, that's really driven by a gap in political will, more than anything. The only other point that I would make is with respect to the notion that, again, migration is manageable and refugee movements are somehow part of that dynamic. Refugees move because they have to move, because they're afraid, because they're threatened, because they can get killed. And it gets more complicated as the years go on, but fundamentally they're not able to go back to their home country. And so they either, as the Deputy Prime Minister said, need to be supported in their countries of first asylum, in the case of Syria, in Turkey, in Jordan, in Iraq, and in Lebanon in particular, or farther afield through resettlement and other structured legal avenues. But the bottom line is that there is not a dichotomy between enforcing and managing borders and enforcing and managing asylum law. We see that whether it's the Department of Homeland Security here or in Europe or anywhere else, that part of the responsibility is to enforce the law, and we are all party to the 1951 Convention and/or its protocol, that we have national legislation that governs the rights of individuals to seek asylum, and that's part of the enforcement imperative for developed states.
Great way of putting it. Catherine.
Okay, let me see where I can add to some of the comments that have already been made. You know, on this question about Germany's decision to welcome people and really the topic of this meeting about open or closed borders, there was a really interesting development yesterday, which was the EU announcing an action plan with Turkey, a comprehensive action plan on refugees and migration management. And I think that shows that even as different member states in the EU are grappling with the immediate challenges at their borders and seeking to both regain control of their borders, but also implement appropriate humanitarian management of their borders when people are physically there, that they're also trying to look as much as possible to the external situation and to the sources. And so in some ways, basically, a cooperative agreement with Turkey to help the European Union secure its external borders, but also very much recognizing the challenging situation that Turkey is in as host to so many refugees. So this agreement involves $1 billion in EU funds to support refugees in Turkey. It has two parts. One is to support Syrian and Iraqi refugees and their host communities in Turkey, and the other is strengthening cooperation to prevent irregular migration. This is both into Turkey and out of Turkey. And I think, what's interesting to us is that many of the steps that Turkey is taking, committing to take action to support self-sufficiency and inclusion of refugees into Turkish society, access to the labor market, education, and health, these are all things that we've been advocating from, as Shelley said, a humanitarian diplomacy perspective for some time, where, to be fair, some progress has been made, but this really, to us, represents a significant step forward. And of course, it's being supported by the EU financially and with this other part of the agreement, which is to strengthen the ability to prevent irregular migration out of Turkey. So I think that's a very interesting development. In terms of how we adapt to this new normal, I think the appeals are probably at about 40% funded now. And some of that is because there's been really concerted outreach to everybody, to Gulf states, to traditional donors, to non-traditional donors in the lead up to the UN General Assembly. Our secretary has spoken with many foreign ministers in Europe about making joint asks to other countries to contribute. So it's gone up somewhat. That's not good. 40% is still not good, but it's better. As Shelley said, there are a lot of international processes going on this year, and I think it really will be interesting and important to see how they come out. The Sustainable Development Goals were launched last week at the UN General Assembly with this headline about nobody left behind, and I think, as Shelley said, the significance of that to displaced people has only increased. We have the World Humanitarian Summit, which will be held in Turkey this spring in May, and I think the challenge really is to bring these things together. The World Humanitarian Summit is talking about how is the international architecture, the international community prepared to respond to prepared to reform itself to better manage the humanitarian crises today, and bringing in the development side of the house is going to be so important. At some of the events, again, last week in New York, the World Bank really acknowledged that this is a whole new area for them to be moving into. There have been high-level panels on financing for development this year. There's one going on right now on financing for humanitarian agencies. So there's a lot of good ideas being generated and a lot of acknowledgement about the directions that the international structures and architectures need to go. Now we just have to do it. We have to see whether this crisis can be part of generating the political will to actually take some hard decisions. The one other aspect of that I wanted to note is just how important private giving has been in this particular crisis. In general, we see the data shows that individual citizens in the US and around the world tend to give a lot more to natural disasters than to conflict-related humanitarian situations. I think it's just more straightforward and easier to contribute to an earthquake or a typhoon and see the tangible impact of your support, and then people pick up their lives. And it's a lot harder when it's an ongoing war. And so it's been really interesting to see in this instance. I think the first UNHCR appeal, which has since been significantly revised up for Europe, About 50% of the funding came from various private sources. We've seen Google raise $11 million through their match funding. Kickstarter just announced yesterday their first ever humanitarian funding drive. The U.S., if you go to aidrefugees.gov, the State Department website gives you all these opportunities to give, and you know, whether it's people in California starting campaigns to send baby carriers to Greece so people can carry their children, or you know, all of these versions of the refugees welcome in Germany. It's just been amazing actually how individual citizens have mobilized, and we need to harness that going forward and make that part of the new normal as well. Finally, on the U.S. process for resettlement, it's a tough question. Well, I mean, it's actually fairly easy to answer. I mean, the politics of refugee admissions and resettlement span the entire spectrum. Every time my leadership, members of my bureau, go up on the Hill to talk about the numbers and the funding, they, you know, in the same breath from different members of Congress will get, why can't we bring 100,000 more, and we should not let a single additional foreigner into our country, right? So that's kind of the space within which we're working. The screening that is done for refugees from everywhere, not just Syria, who are resettled in the United States is more comprehensive than any other category of traveler. And there are good reasons for this. I mean, being resettled in the U.S. as a refugee is legal permanent residency. It's a path to citizenship. We have to maintain the public confidence in the program. It's very, very important, and we will continue to ensure that there is very robust security screening for people entering the United States. That said, I can say that there are ongoing, very real, live, real-time discussions about how those processes can be further streamlined and sped up, and even how the numbers can be increased as well. Everything that's been announced is sort of a floor for now. There's a desire to see how numbers can be increased.
Fantastic. With your forgiveness, I'm going to be able to only take one question because the Deputy Prime Minister has another meeting. I asked too many questions, so I'll take the blame on that. But maybe we can take one or sneak two, and then we'll let our panelists respond. I'll take, your hand was first up, so why don't we let you be our lucky questioner for the day.
Thank you.
Please identify yourself.
Okay, so my name is Xiang Yuyan. I'm from the Cato Institute. So I have a question for Ms. Wiesner. So in terms of the Secretary John Kerry said we're going to take additional 185,000 refugees. Who are the priorities of the refugees? And the second one is what actions the State Department has done to cooperate with individual states in the United States to resettle these refugees, because as from the state of New Hampshire, there are so many refugees from Bangladesh, from a lot of different countries, but there are pushbacks in the state legislatures, and the states are saying we can't take refugees anymore. So how do we respond to that? Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the new numbers that were announced for this next fiscal year and the following year, we have basically a sort of informal, it's not really a quota system, but we have sort of targets for around the world. So the president had announced that we would take at least 10,000 Syrians next year. So that's the only sort of specific population that's been named. I mean, traditionally we have a lot of refugees from the Middle East, a lot of refugees from Africa. There's actually don't have the list with me. Do you, Shelley, know our top populations? Yeah, from Asia. So far, last year there were about 1,500 Syrians that came as part of the resettlement program. There will be at least 10,000 starting from October 1st until the end of the fiscal year. That's also part of that. That's captured within the 85,000. Yeah. In terms of cooperation with the states, so we have 9 affiliates, which are non-governmental organizations, which do the placements and initial assistance to refugees once they arrive. And they are the ones who actually manage the day-to-day operations with the state governments around where people will be settled, and the kind of assistance that they get sometimes as follow-on assistance from social services of that state and from Health and Human Services. That said, I think we see part of our humanitarian diplomacy role as a domestic one as well. So My boss, the Assistant Secretary, Ann Richard, was just in South Carolina talking to local officials about some of their concerns about being consulted. And I think we find it's not generally that communities say we don't want refugees or we can't take any more refugees. It's usually a matter of sort of consultation and planning and making sure the school systems are prepared to receive more children and things like that. There's a conference, I think today, at the State Department with various mayors around the U.S. Who are coming to discuss refugee resettlement and other issues, and it's a little bit the same spectrum. You know, we have like the mayor of Detroit saying we'd like to take 50,000 refugees. We could really use them to revitalize our downtown. We have many examples where refugees have, you know, they open businesses, they kind of make neighborhoods more vibrant. So we have so many positive examples, and in the occasions where there is some amount of pushback, I think we usually are able to address that through dialogue, through community town halls, through outreach to local officials.
Catherine, I'm so sorry, we're going to have to finish up, but the Deputy Prime Minister leaned over and goes, these are exactly the same questions I get and we get in Europe. And what this conversation really illuminated for me is that we have much to learn about our own processes as much as we're watching events unfold in Europe. What a rich discussion. I learned a great deal. Thank you to all three of you, particularly for the Deputy Prime Minister to spare some time out of his very busy schedule in Washington from a very unique perspective. Catherine, Shelly, thank you so much. Rich in fact. We need to keep having this conversation clearly from a public diplomacy, but also from a transatlantic perspective. So with your applause, will you please join me in thanking three outstanding panelists.